The outrage over religious freedom bills in Indiana and Arkansas last week has caught many by surprise. Other states are looking at similar legislation, and here to give us the big picture and explain some of what has been happening is Tim Schultz. He's the president of First Amendment Partnership, which works with faith groups and state lawmakers on religious liberty issues. Tim, you told the Associated Press last week that the brand has definitely been tarnished. What do you see that has happened that Americans now question whether they're for or against religious liberty?
Well, remember that the original Religious Freedom Restoration Act passed the Congress in 1993 with only a handful of dissenting votes. It was sponsored by Ted Kennedy and Chuck Schumer. It was signed into law by President Clinton. It was supported by religious groups left, right, and center. And today, the very same legislation has now become a cultural flashpoint, a controversy. And so I meant, when I talked to the AP, that in that sense, something that used to be as American as motherhood and apple pie has now become very controversial. And I think those of us in faith communities and who work on these issues have got to do a really good job of explaining what we're really after here.
Right. Lawmakers in more than a dozen states have introduced religious freedom bills, despite this kind of climate. What do you see as behind that momentum?
Well, I think it's more what has happened over about the last 5 years. I think you have seen challenges to religious freedom beginning about 5 years ago that we really didn't see in the period immediately after the passage of the original RFRA in 1993. You've seen, for instance, Little Sisters of the Poor being forced by the federal government to pay for drugs that cause abortion. That's just not something that happened in the late 1990s. And I think legislators are responding to this overall threat matrix and saying, what is it that's been a proven mechanism of balancing religious freedom with other important government interests? And that's why I think they are supporting this kind of legislation.
All right. Now, LGBT advocates say that these bills will allow businesses to outright refuse service to LGBT customers. Should LGBT persons be worried about these bills, in your view?
I don't think so. And really, this is a common misunderstanding in the law. In most parts of the United States, it is currently legal to refuse service to somebody on the basis of LGBT status, not because of the presence of religious freedom laws, but because of the absence of laws that make that kind of refusal of service illegal. Even when that kind of refusal of service is legal in most places, people just don't do that kind of thing because we have a decent country. I mean, Governor Pence said, and I agree, if I knew that a restaurant was not serving gay people because they were gay, I would join the boycott myself. The real controversy, I think, is about this much narrower band of cases having to do with the weddings and same-sex marriage. But there's not any movement on our side of this issue to deny LGBT people service in general commerce.
Okay, so what you're saying is that these religious freedom bills are specifically looking at specific cases where conscience would be violated, not giving someone an outright blanket, legal bedrock to say you can refuse service to someone.
Well, keep in mind that the bills that have been, the Indiana bill, for instance, very nationally controversial. It doesn't guarantee that the religious person is going to win. So I am confident and the best legal scholars in the country are unanimous in saying that if there ever were such a case, my restaurant hypothetical, where somebody were kicked out of the restaurant for being gay, and somebody tried to defend using one of these laws, they would lose in court, and they'd be responsible for damages, attorney's fees. I mean, and I would join the gay couple in that case. I don't think that is religious liberty properly understood.
All right. Now, after considerable outcry, both Indiana and Arkansas have fixed their laws. Do you see these changes as weakening the religious liberty protections?
I would say I prefer Arkansas's fix because Arkansas's fix became identical to the federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act. I think that's a reasonable compromise. That law has been in place for 21 years. Its effects are known. We haven't seen rampant discrimination. We really haven't even seen any scare cases, because if they had existed, we could be sure that the opponents would cite them. And so I think that's a reasonable compromise, what Arkansas did.
All right. And what about Indiana? What do you think about the fix there?
Well, I think that fix is more troublesome. I understand why they felt like they needed to do it, but I think that carving out whole areas from these religious freedom laws and saying that religious freedom always loses in certain contexts is a dangerous path to take.
Tim, right now there are other states that are considering religious freedom legislation. Where do things stand? How many states are actually going forward?
Well, about 15 states are considering various kinds of religious freedom bills, not just RFRAs. This is a complex area of policy. I think a lot of people will ask, why in the heck are legislators dealing with this issue? Isn't religious freedom protected in our Constitution? And the reason that they're doing this is because actually the Supreme Court has ruled that religious freedom is very thinly protected in our Constitution. And so that is why legislators, not just in this area of same-sex marriage, but on a whole variety of issues, are dealing with these issues, and I think that's going to continue.
If the Supreme Court rules in favor of gay marriage this year, what might that mean for these religious freedom laws or bills that are being considered?
Well, I do think that it will mean that right now the issue of same-sex marriage and religious freedom have become merged in the public mind. I think that's to some degree unhealthy because I don't think that's what motivates supporters of religious freedom, at least not entirely. I think that if the court does what you suggested, I think that will merge these issues even more in a way that's probably likely to lead to more cultural conflict, and I think that's unfortunate.
So do you think that some of these RFRA laws, as we call them, religious freedom laws, might be threatened if the Supreme Court is ruling to redefine marriage?
Well, I don't think they'll be threatened in the sense that they're going to be struck down as unconstitutional. I think, in fact, the federal RFRA is squarely constitutional, and there really hasn't ever been a legal challenge to a state RFRA. I mean, they're not singling out gay people for disfavor or anything like that. So I'm very comfortable with their constitutional status.
All right. And going forward, what do you think is the best way to talk about religious freedom legislation, given that, as you said, it's become such a cultural flashpoint?
Well, I think those of us who favor robust religious freedom have to recognize that there are concerns from there's a lot of cheap and fake concern, but I think that there's also in just middle America a concern about a blanket license to discriminate. I think people do worry that their gay and lesbian friends and neighbors are going to be discriminated against by a restaurant throwing them out of their restaurant. And I think we have to make very clear with our actions and the legislation we support that that is in fact not the case.
It sounds like you are in favor of legislation that would provide ways for protections for LGBT persons so that they're not discriminated against alongside these religious liberty protections. Do you think there's a balance there? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think some legislators have concluded that. I wouldn't say, I represent a number of faith communities who would come out differently on that issue, and so there's not unanimity on that. But I think it's fair to say that a reasonable legislator could conclude that part of getting religious freedom right is also drawing clear lines in the legislation that make it clear that some of the things we all agree are wrong simply cannot happen.
All right, Tim Schultz with First Amendment Partnership, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.